Okay. So, what a great occasion to talk about foreign policy issues. As far as I know, there's not much going on, right? I want to read you a quote from Dr. Vickers' book that I think will be a great way to segue into our conversation tonight. And he writes, I'm increasingly concerned about the future of American power and our ability to win our wars, both cold and hot. Our country faces a more challenging national security environment today than it has at any time since the height of the Cold War. And I think that's an interesting segue to the challenges that we're facing as a nation tonight. So the first thing I'd like to do is to ask you to help me welcome Dr. Vickers to Duke. And maybe the way to start off is just to perhaps share a few of your observations about maybe our pressing issues. There's a lot going on today in Iran, Russia, China, just kind of a broader philosophy, and then we can dig into some of it.
Sure, sounds great. It's great to be here at Duke. I think I was last here when I was still on active duty in 2014 or something. Professor Fever had me here, and great in particular to be with the program on American Grand Strategy. I hear there's some school up in Connecticut that has a similar program, and they have aspirations to be like Duke, but they haven't quite made it yet. So it's really great to be here. So the environment we face now, two big factors. One, the return of great power competition, principally with China, but also Russia. And then this revolution in technology, the artificial intelligence, quantum computing, synthetic biology, even fusion and a few other areas. And then within that, to kind of put it in today's context, for the first time since the early Cold War, we have two threats, great power threats on the Eurasian landmass. And it's been a long-standing principle of American foreign policy not to let one power or a combination of powers to dominate the Eurasian landmass. And then you just got a lot of mess elsewhere, including the Middle East, which, is if it were like Las Vegas, what happened there would stay there, but it's not. So, it continues. So happy to dive deeper into any of that.
Good. Well, I think we cover a couple contemporary issues, and I want to get into some of the topics of your book. But the first one is, one of the things that you write in your book is that you didn't think we got the policy in Syria or the policy as it relates to Iran exactly right, with some of the actions that they were taking and some of the responses that we could have done, maybe that we didn't do. So is the current conflict in Gaza, is that something that the United States could have acted more effectively before it happened and maybe helped to prevent it?
I don't think so, in a sense that, one, you've had five now, Hamas, Israel wars, smaller scale previously, but since 2008 or so, 2009. And, the Israelis have had really responsibility for Gaza in terms of intelligence. We cooperate with them a lot on Hezbollah and then particularly on Iran. And also since the Oslo agreement and stuff, one of the unheralded successes of American foreign policy was to work with the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank to build up their capabilities. And it really helped, after the Second Intifada, it really helped produce an operational peace between Israel and the PA. So much so, when I talk to my Israeli counterparts, they would say, we've delivered. Now the politicians on both sides can't bring it to, peace and a two-state solution, but, really a good environment. So, that's sort of the extent of U.S. policy, but, Gaza is a combination of intelligence analysis failure, but fundamentally a policy failure in a sense, or not. having sufficient forces there to deter them and not believing that Hamas was really capable of doing this.
And Syria seems to be a bit of a mess too, doesn't it?
Syria has been a mess since the civil war began with Arab Spring, and massive migrant flows and terrorist groups, and lots of people having free reign in the country.
Yeah, so it's just it is interesting that you read in the news so much about China and Russia, but then this Middle East is sucking all of the bandwidth for the last, month or two. And I think if the administration had its way, they would refocus on perhaps our strongest great power competitor, China, and trying to kind of manage Chinese aggression. You've talked a little bit about that in your book. Maybe characterize what's happening with China and how the United States is trying to develop a strategy for China.
Yeah, so the central competition with China is really economic and technological. And I think since 2018, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have recognized that and really changed our China strategy of engage and hedge that we had since the end of the Cold War, which, both sides kind of recognized it wasn't working so well. So you see the restrictions on high technology, the highest NVIDIA chips, and elsewhere, the attention paid to alliances, and then trying to deter a Taiwan conflict, and particularly what we call a porcupine defense, by trying to really harden the island with a lot of unmanned systems and other things, short range, just to stop a cross-strait invasion. But of course, there's other ways Taiwan could be defeated, missile and air blockade and sea blockade, et cetera. So it's a tough problem. Xi is the most forceful Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping, but he seems to want to be Mao Zedong as much as he does Deng Xiaoping, and he's kind of hurt the economy. China's economy has had other problems, but it's kind of killing the golden goose to some degree. So that trajectory that they were on has slowed a bit. But it's really the central competition of our day. And then, one of the things we pride ourselves as Americans is that we have lots of allies, and our adversaries tend not to have many. That's changing a bit as you see this cooperation between China and Russia, and then Iran joining the party, and even North Korea.
During the 80s, we had a number of scholarly pathways focused on deterrence and focused on effective deterrence and trying to figure that out. But the modern context appears to show that U.S. approaches to deterrence don't seem to be very effective right now. Is that a shortfall in coming out of 20 years of the war on terrorism and not really focusing on deterrent strategies, or is it some other kind of dynamic that is hindering America's ability just to deter malign behavior?
Yeah, so you can't deter everything, but you try to deter the big things. But a number of things have really undermined deterrence. So one of them is, that you can do these information operations to intervene directly in politics, and they do it way more to us than we do it to them. But we don't have an effective deterrent there. And then in the smaller wars, it never helps to be on the losing side or to show reluctance to, deterrence requires the threat or use of force to be credible. And so, if you look at it since, say, 2014, as we started seeing the rise of great power competition again, we didn't really support the Ukrainians very much in 2014, 2015. And then we had Russian intervention in Syria when we were getting tired of Syria. And then we had a Russian intervention in our presidential election in 2016, and we slapped them a little bit, but not much. And then you bring it full forward, and we decide we'd rather be defeated than more or less on top in a stalemate in Afghanistan. So if you're Putin, you look at this and you think, boy, these guys are pushovers, and you just can't have deterrence. When one of the common themes of all our adversaries rightly or wrongly, and it's mostly wrong, but they really have an assessment of the United States that we're weak and in decline. So if you go from China to Al Qaeda, they have that view, and or Al Qaeda and ISIS, the global jihadists, and so that's not healthy for deterrence.
Well, just to put a fine tip on it, is that something that we should be pursuing to get better? Should deterrence be a focus of a American policy?
Yeah, I mean, the administration came out with we do a national defense strategy and national security strategy every 4 years, and came out with this concept of integrated deterrence right as Putin, invaded Ukraine. So I don't know what it was supposed to do, but it didn't do it. And but you have to tackle these problems to some extent in their own areas, and then you build overall deterrence. So I remember talking with officials, senior officers in Cyber Command who said, well, we don't really want to hit someone back in cyber because we're more vulnerable. We're the most cyber society in the world. Well, it's probably not going to work out too well if you just let your adversaries, treat you as a punching bag and knowing you're not going to hit them back.
Yeah, good. I want to introduce a couple terms that you use frequently in your book. And the first one is escalation dominance. Could you explain to the audience your concept of escalation dominance, and then maybe give a couple examples of where you as a policymaker really pushed an administration or a national security apparatus to gain and hold escalation dominance?
Yeah, so escalation kind of grows out of the Cold War and in the nuclear realm, and you have Herman Kahn with his ladders and stuff, but it applies to all levels of conflict, and it really is kind of a synonym for really gaining the upper hand in a conflict and it doesn't mean, again, just a conventional conflict or anything else, but where you can then achieve a decisive outcome. So and so if you look at World War II, we had mobilization dominance. We could lose the initial battles, and then we would build up our, Admiral Yamamoto famously said, we will conquer East Asia in 6 months and run wild, but we've woken up a sleeping giant and we're going to end up losing in the end. And it was a pretty good predictor of the war in the Pacific. We also had a big intelligence advantage over Nazi Germany and Japan in World War II, and that contributed the logistical side, the societal mobilization and intelligence, and then building up our armed forces, to the outcome in World War II. So you take it out of the nuclear realm. My experience in the CIA with Afghanistan, for the first 5 years, we had a strategy where we didn't think we could win at all. We just wanted to impose costs on the Soviet occupation in the 1980s. And then that really changed through a variety of factors. And President Reagan signed a national security decision directive in March 1985 that changed our strategy to driving the Soviets out by all means available. And that's where the title of my book came. I liked it when I was a CIA officer in my 30s, and I still like it today. And so we went and between 1984 and 18 months, between the fall of 84 and the spring of 86, we went from giving the Afghan resistance 10,000 metric tons of ordnance a year to 65,000 to 80,000. So, went up by a factor of 8. We had like 20 man-portable surface-to-air missile systems in 1984, and we had 2,000. 1986. So got very hazardous for Soviet aircraft. We were training a couple thousand Afghan resistance a year. We took that up to 20,000. So everything increased by a factor of 10, and our budget increased by a factor of 10. And and at the end of the day, the Soviets surged, like they added another 25,000 troops to their 100,000 in Afghanistan right after Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. And we surged at the same time. We went up by a factor of 10. And, 12 months later, he was saying, okay, we're getting out of this place. And so I call that a kind of covert action escalation dominance, where we won this battle of surges. Now, it's very dependent on having a Mikhail Gorbachev instead of a Vladimir Putin as well. Against Al Qaeda, by leveraging American air power with our special operators and CIA, we were able to overthrow the Taliban. You know, we had a checkmate that they couldn't really counter. As Al Qaeda fled into the federally administered tribal areas, once we started a real intense drone campaign, some policy innovations and some technical, Al Qaeda's back was broken by early 2011, that they couldn't plan, they couldn't do a range of things. And so, and then I contrast that with areas like Syria or others where we failed to achieve it. It didn't mean we couldn't. We just, for policy reasons, decided not to. We tend to lose those, you know, and so that's one of the themes I tried to explain in my book is why do we win in seemingly tougher cases and lose in easier cases? It's because you're ceding this to the enemy. If you look at Russia, Ukraine right now, you know, we're very concerned about Russian escalation. We've kind of ceded that to them, and we eventually get there, but we get there gradually and slowly. You know, we say we're not going to give them long-range missiles, or we're not going to give them artillery. Then we do, and then long-range missiles, and then air defense systems, and then tanks, and then fighters. And that's not a way to fight. You know, speed, scale, and scope in some cases really matter. I mean, that's how you kind of shock your enemy.
Since you mentioned the first campaign in Afghanistan in the 80s, from your book, you offered like 4 strategic lines of action. I think they're really important. I'm going to read them, and then you can tell me, like, is this a model for the future? Are there some key takeaways for long-term learning? The first was you recommended that we shift the air balance in the insurgents' favor. And that was the blowpipes that you got from Prime Minister Thatcher and the Stingers and the other air defense systems to try to.
Well, it was first Chinese, Soviet missiles. Yeah.
But they didn't work, right?
Well, some others didn't, but the Chinese did. Yeah.
Okay. And then enable resistance to conduct more complicated, more larger, complex operations. So the training that you were talking about and equipping.
And combined arms, like a lot more heavy weapons, anti-tank weapons, mortars, etc. Yeah.
Increase resistance, the op tempo, so more frequent activity to wear the Soviet forces down.
Right, and that's a function, like in Ukraine, of ammunition. You know, like that sustains op tempo.
And the last one, which I found to be particularly interesting, is to take the fight to Kabul.
Yeah.
To Kabul and to urban areas. And what was the lot?
Well, and bases.
Yeah.
So we supplied a lot of Chinese rocket launchers that could harass the Soviets all the time in their bases in Kabul. And by 1986, we got a really lucky hit on the biggest ammunition depot in Kabul, and it said Kabul was. You know, you just aim it, you know, sneak up to within 10 kilometers and aim these rockets on wooden makeshift like sawhorse or something, and you know, you hit something.
All the military guys in the room are like, "That's awesome."
Yeah. So you know, we use like delay devices. So I think it's called time pencils, so that the guys can get away. But yeah, so that was kind of the elements of the strategy. And then I recognized, you know, and so at the time I got this job, I was the luckiest guy on earth. You know, it was 4 grades above where I was in CIA at the time, and the budget had just been quadrupled by Congressman Charlie Wilson. And, you know, CIA had asked for a 10% budget increase, and they got a 300% budget increase, which you don't see every day in government. And so I kind of divided the strategy between what I could do on my own with CIA authority, as long as my chain of command supported it, which they did, but what I would need others to do as well, decisions that I couldn't make or our government. And so one of them was, you know, changing our goal, which again, there was a National Security Council review, and out of that came this decision to change our goal of the war to winning it rather than just imposing costs. So President Reagan signed that, but if he hadn't, we would have had a lot more money with the same old objective. And then getting all our allies to go along. You know, you got to win the battle in your allies' capital as well as your own. So convincing the Pakistanis that, you know, we're going to do this different thing, and convincing the Chinese and the Saudis matched us dollar for dollar, doubling our budget. So had to go and convince all of them, you know, here, go along with this crazy idea, which took some effort, but they did. And then to start, the way covert programs go is usually, we start by supplying Soviet weapons, paramilitary efforts. And then when we want to be a little more effective and we're a little less concerned about secrecy, we might bring in Western weapons, hence the British blowpipe. And then when we really are less concerned about secrecy, we go American in certain cases. And we did that with the Stinger, but also frequency, the most advanced radios in the world, so they couldn't get direction found and others. And so, when I think of Margaret Thatcher, the blowpipe is something it's like a joy, you guys all know this, or joystick you got to manipulate with your thumb, and it takes some effort to control the darn thing and not have it fly into the ground. But I think of Margaret Thatcher, my thumb just wants a twitch, so she made a really gutsy decision and paved the way for the US. And then we went back to Congress and said, we know you just quadrupled our budget, but if we got this change in strategy, but if you'll just double it one more time, we can win this thing. And sure enough, they did. And again, you don't see that every day. So our budget went up by a factor of 12 in 12 months.
It's very impressive. And is that a model? I mean, right now, I think many people would assess that we're kind of slogging around in a bunch of different spots.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And so we were slogging before 84 or before 85 a little bit.
And we're doing all right, but there was no prospect of winning.
So how did you not you, but how did the administration come to terms with there's an opportunity to accept more risk and to do more demonstrably to shift the strategy? It actually happened because we're waiting for that to happen today.
Yeah, so it's a combination of things. One, as we showed we could be responsible with this big increase, that it wasn't going to be wasted early on. And we started to get results on the battlefield in early 85. That laid the groundwork for more. So I was in Islamabad, and as I was starting to think about this in March of 1985, and I sent a cable back and said, I know we got 500 million a year, but we need 1.2 billion. And this is on a Saturday, and poor Director Casey almost had a heart attack. And fortunately, one of my bosses said, no, just give him a little rope here, and it's not and it took 5 more months to actually get it, from Congress and getting CIA to go along. But also a big thing was Ronald Reagan and in particular, and Margaret Thatcher wanted to win the Cold. They didn't want to perpetuate it and get out of crises. They didn't know how they were going to win it, but they wanted for the US and the West to prevail. And, that then gives you the kind of the running room to do some things like this. And that's how the National Security Decision Directive came out of that President Reagan signed, and then deciding to introduce the Stinger, which was a very gutsy decision. And, by then the Soviets were starting to look for the exits. People think that it changed the war. It just kind of piled on, but it was very, very effective. And then I remember the White House at one point got nervous, at least some of the staffers, about this big escalation that the Soviets would invade Pakistan. They didn't really have the wherewithal to do that. But as I was taking around all the decision papers, a guy who later became my boss in defense, Bob Gates, was the head of analysis. And I told him, the White House wants you to certify that we're not going to start World War III by doing this stuff. And he said, I've read it, I'm good with it. And he signed it. And I got out of the office as fast as I could before he changed his mind. But I teased him about that ever since, about, boy, that was a gutsy decision. We might have started World War III, but anyway.
Oh, that's good. Well, so then the logical follow-on question is, you just said that Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan made a conscious decision to win the Cold War.
Yeah.
So we're entering this strategic competition, great power competition. Do we have the same political intentions to win the great power competition from your perspective?
Yeah, not in the same way. I think, yes, we think we're going to, but there's a lot of brakes put on things that you wouldn't if you really believed it. So as I said, we've toughened up our technology strategy, and but not the same way as the 80s. I mean, we did our best in the Cold War at the beginning, Truman and Eisenhower, and then kind of lost our way in the middle decades,
Sure.
60s and 70s, and then recovered in the 80s and did really well. And these long-term competitions tend to have that dynamic.
So we have these magnificent members of our national security apparatus, the intelligence community, the military, law enforcement, and they're trying to understand what they should be doing. We are constantly telling them the growing threat of Russia, Chinese, Iran, North Korea, and other growing manifest threats. And so you seem to say that deterrence is important, but it's not central, and that winning the great power competition is not important. I mean, it is not central. So how do we share a clear understanding of the way forward with those who are in the apparatus now, coming out of the war on terrorism and trying to figure out how they should prepare and how they should contribute?
Yeah. So one, you need a general approach, and it's tougher now in a sense, in we made real rapid change between 1946 and 1949. Aid to Greece and Turkey, who were under subversion at the time, Marshall Plan, National Security Act that created a separate Air Force, CIA, Secretary of Defense, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and National Security Council, and then NATO, all in the span of a Berlin airlift in there, all in the span of 3 years. That's harder to do today in a more gradual rise with crises like Ukraine. But, the China problem is more like a 19th century balance of power shift than it is, big army occupying at the end of a war half of Europe and the rest of Europe, prostrate, on the ground, and needing to be invulnerable. So, it concentrated the mind a lot more. So it takes a different kind of leadership to do this. And then, as John Lewis Gaddis wrote, it's strategies of containment. You need an overarching philosophy, but administrations are going to modify it a bit. But you hope you have some consistency as you go forward, because it's likely to take decades. And, you check them where you can, and then hopefully either get a leader who rises that can help bring an end to it and the system mellows, or something else happens. Again, my old boss, Bob Gates, liked to say, people thought that Mikhail Gorbachev must have been a CIA agent for the way he brought down the Soviet Union. And the answer is, thank heavens he wasn't. We never could have had him do all the things that he did on his own. So, but anyway, yeah, so it's, the important thing for people in the mid-career point or starting out is to, your contributions are important. Like, the FBI is much maligned these days. They got the problem for them has never been bigger. They need more, and I hope that they stop becoming a political football, because, the problems of technology competition and technology threat, domestic extremism, as well as international, the counterintelligence threat is up. Their job jar just got a lot bigger the last decade. And so we need them firing on all cylinders, and, and others in our staff. It's national security is a team sport.
Yeah, yeah. At the end of the book, you talk about a number of competitions that you're worried about going forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought maybe you could, first of all, introduce students to anti-access area denial, and this concept and how it came about, and perhaps how the United States woke up to it a little bit late, that it was happening.
Sure. So it's common pattern in history that, when you have great powers and alliances, once one is defeated, you can shift, where someone who was your ally then realizes, well, there's two of us left now. And so you're my, I was your partner before, now I'm your rival. And that's what happened with China. So I spent a lot of time in China in the 1980s. They were our secret partner against the Soviets. And they were the best students of the Desert Storm, of the Persian Gulf War. a lot of foreign militaries looked at it for lessons, as we always do, like with Ukraine today and others. And they looked at it and said, what a stupid idea to give the United States 6 months to build up 500,000 troops right on the Iraqi border and then bomb them and then invade, and kick them out of Kuwait. The better strategy is to make it difficult for them to get into theater and contest it. And so that's what anti-access and aerial denial came out of it when they didn't have that much capability, but they thought, we're going to be a rival of the United States decades from now. We don't want to provoke them too early. So they built up their missile force and they built up their cyber force and they built up space capabilities over time. And we recognize this. Some of us in the Department of Defense recognized this in the early 90s, but the Department of Defense codified it in the 2001 strategy review, saying this is going to be a problem. And most of that was written right before 9/11. And so after, the report was due to be released on September 30th. And so 9/11 happens and there's this quick scurrying to rewrite it to say, oh yeah, those terrorists are a big problem and we're going to go deal with them right now. But the department really didn't act on it. It increased, converted old nuclear fleet ballistic missile submarines for them to conventional guided missile submarines, SSGNs as we call them. They're coming to the end of their life now, but that was about it. And of course, we were involved in, very quickly, Afghanistan, then Iraq, and then things elsewhere. And then in 2006, we started expanding our submarine force more. And while we were expanding the Army and Navy for the Army and Marine Corps for Iraq and Afghanistan, we started a new bomber program that's now become the B-21 with China in mind. But we were busy with other stuff, and part of it was in response to this anti-access problem. So if you talk to the Navy in the 2000s, the first decade, they would say there's no way the Chinese will ever be able to sink surface ships, off the coast of China, hundreds of miles off the coast of China. By 2011, 2012, that attitude changed that, yeah, they can do it. And so we better shift more to submarines where, we have a big advantage, for that fight. And so, it was a gradual, the Chinese embarked on this path. They're still on it today. They've been adding capabilities, and then we're kind of catching up.
The second quality, we're not going to go through all of them, but what got my attention is hiders and finders, right? And this idea of using data, using locational information, and trying to create some versions of certainty. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's a competition that as you get more capable intelligence capabilities with space and with what we call penetrating intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, it's hard to hide. But there's ways, and it becomes, while the overall environment may be more transparent, there's advantages to hiding. So for instance, nobody wants to fight us out in the open. So what do terrorists and what do insurgents do? They become more like terrorists. They do IEDs and others. They don't give you the chance to really clobber them, and so it's part of this hider finder competition. And then one of the things we're able to do with our special operations forces, beginning in Iraq, is to turn raids into campaigns by really exploiting the intelligence very rapidly, a thing we call find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, where you capture somebody, you can interrogate them right away, you exploit their media, and maybe you hit all the targets that same night before they can figure out, hey, Joe's gone, we better move. And so it really produced a lot of success against Al-Qaeda in Iraq and some others. And so part of that competition again. And you have stealth, a lot of different aspects to this: stealth, counter stealth, and others. But it applied to our drone campaigns against Al-Qaeda. Same thing. And one of the kind of the hearkening back to World War II is we can go into a place not knowing very much, like Iraq or something, but give us a couple of years and we're going to learn a lot. And we started really So if you compare, say, 2007, 2008 versus 2003, we were just firing on all cylinders by then.
We learned it.
We learned.
If we can talk about a couple controversial issues
Okay.
that are in your book. The first one is this concept of signature strikes.
Okay.
Could you tell the assembled audience what a signature strike is and why, and how you came to be a strong supporter and find them helpful in our efforts?
Yeah, so this really applies to the drone campaigns and drone warfare. And so inside a war zone, lots of combat going on. Our military and operates under rules of engagement that we call reasonable certainty, which means you have a lot of lawyerly definitions to this, but you have reasonable certainty that your target is who you think it is and that collateral damage is reasonably minimized. But it's a more reduced standard than if you're bombing a country with which you're not. Well, that's where Al-Qaeda went after we kicked them out of Afghanistan to Pakistan and other places. And so we had a higher standard called near certainty that meant, you had to know who your target was and zero collateral damage. Now, you're not going to be perfect. You're aiming for perfection, but you get 99 or 98%. There could be someone inside a building you can't see. But when we designed our operations, for instance, with laser guided missiles, you have to be able to shift that missile to an empty area or something off the target if, say, a child runs across at the last minute, or so it's a real high standard for fighting a war. But one of the keys to success in linking policy and strategy with intelligence is to make the most of the intelligence you have. It's not perfect, it's usually quite good. And so there's two types of drone strikes: a personality strike, where this is Al-Qaeda leader Joe Blow. You have all the intelligence and then you strike them. Or what became called the signature strikes, where it's a senior Al-Qaeda leader from all their signatures, but you don't know who it is. And, you end up finding that out afterwards. And so by the policy decision made by President Bush and sustained by President Obama to allow these, it really increased the op tempo, again, this escalation dominance against Al-Qaeda. So we did as many strikes the last 5 months of 2008, the last months of President Bush's administration, than we had the previous 4 years. And Al-Qaeda said, what happened? Suddenly the world changed on us. And so while we didn't kill one Al-Qaeda senior leader, high value target in 2007, in the last 4 months, we killed 8 and, started really devastating. And so that's essentially the idea that and so a couple years later, like by 2011, when Al-Qaeda went to ground, 60% of the top Al-Qaeda leaders who were killed by signature strikes, not personality strikes. So it was an important kind of recognition that this is where the intelligence, you still had to have the near certainty and everything else, but not the precision. Well, I'm just going to wait till I know it's Joe Blow or something, because you may never get that.
So you're looking also for a profile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what a signature is behavior that they do and everything. So, yeah.
The second controversial issue is, I think they use the term enhanced interrogation.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned this in your book,
Mm-hmm.
and you say that it provided really worthwhile intelligence in your pursuit in the global war on terrorism. So maybe explain to we've had a lot of the other side here at Duke, and so this is your chance to explain the purpose and the intent and the outcome.
Yeah. So, so you have to separate the operational effects from the strategic or ethical or moral. And so, the trouble is people tend to conflate those. So on the one side, if you're opposed to it, you say it never works. If you torture someone or just, do the stuff we do to our special forces soldiers in training, they're going to say anything you want. Well, it's not really true. I mean, so you do get intelligence, but then you have to face the reality. Are you doing harm to your overall foreign policy? If a secret program is disclosed, as generally they always are eventually, or, you want the American people to say, okay, I see why that was secret, and I'm glad my government's doing it, rather than what the hell are they doing? This is wildly inconsistent with our values. And, and so that's where the real rub is. But the Senate Intelligence Committee did a 6,000 page study on enhanced interrogation techniques and looked at 20 cases from finding Osama bin Laden to others and said it never produced any intelligence. Well, when you take such an extreme position that, it was all a failure, so you're really stupid for having done this, you make the debate kind of ridiculous, because if it was such a failure, nobody would really do it unless they're sadists or something. So CIA and the IC rebutted that. But, as I said, the real debate then is about, okay, I'm getting intelligence, but is the juice worth the squeeze in terms of the trade-off you make between values and others? And that's what a top policymaker really has to wrestle with. And the president, and the climate was different after 9/11 than it was a decade later. So a lot of Congress people who supported it in 2002 had amnesia by 2008 and can't remember supporting it. But it still raises the question of, like, I think, with covert action, there's a reason it's covert, but you can't get too divorced from your overt policy. If you are, you're going to run into trouble.
Good. I wanted to read a sentence from your book that I think every military person envies. And this is what you said. I went into Grenada with my handgun, a bag of operational cash to pay assets, and quite literally the shirt on my back and an olive green Ralph Lauren polo, linen pants, and loafers, having packed completely inappropriately for a combat mission. Were those a few years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't think there's those linen pants or Ralph Lauren polo shirts anymore. But yeah, literally, we made the Grenada, for those of you who don't know, 1983, we invaded the island. There was an intra-communist coup, communist prime minister who'd been in power for 5 years. He got overthrown by his deputy and it got bloodied. But the reason it got in, Cubans were building a giant airfield and other stuff. But the reason it got the White House's attention is there were 600 plus Americans who were attending medical school there. And they were kind of hostages, as this coup was progressing. And so the invasion was planned over a weekend. From Saturday, the decision was made, and the invasion was launched on a Tuesday, October 25th. So I had been working 24-hour shifts from Friday all day through Saturday to support this NSC meeting. I had 10 years in special forces at that point, but I'd only been in CIA for 4 months. I haven't even been to my ops training yet. And I get a call, wake me up Sunday morning before I was supposed to come back in and say, pack for 2 weeks. I thought I was going to a base to support the invasion. So I had all these suits and ties and stuff like that. And as soon as I got into CIA headquarters, they said, you and 2 others are going in with the invasion force. And, we're kind of winging it. So literally I had, these things. And I thought, this isn't how we did it in the special forces, but you got to hand it to CIA. They got a certain sense of style, and so I got a handgun and a bunch of cash and a satellite communication. And, when we got on the ground, with the initial special operators, we had different targets. The first thing I wanted to do was get my hands on a bunch of AKs we captured from the Rangers had captured from the Cubans. So I had something a little better than a pistol. And then, we had no transportation as we were setting up our station. So we had to hotwire an East German 10-ton truck, just or airfield in the stupid truck and then God bless CIA. They go out and buy us a Suzuki Jeep and fly it in like the next day. So then we could drive around in a little more style. But yeah, it's an unusual way to go to war. But
well, the head of all Army Special Forces is here tonight, and I think that that's what every Special Forces person wants to do, right? A pistol, a bag full of cash, and some vague intent, right?
Yeah, you make it up as you go.
It's really wonderful. Well, I have one more question, and then I'd like to maybe
Sure.
just start taking questions from the audience. And my question is this: can you offer a 3 to 4 year forecast about the status of of U.S. national security, um, and how we're going to, like, a lot of students here have a couple more years at Duke. You feel like we're going to be okay? It seems like there's a lot of domestic turbulence, a lot of overseas turbulence, a lot of challenges, not enough money. And so there's what I feel when I talk to Duke students is a little bit of cynicism about where we're headed. Maybe you could just address that and then we'll take some questions.
Yeah. So one, if you look at the original Cold War, things don't go the way you plan. You have a long-term strategy, but lots of stuff intervenes. You get the Korean War, you get blockading and subverting, and you're drawn into stuff, and then you have to sort out, what do I do where and everything else. And that's likely to continue. So not only do we have the shock of Putin's invasion of Ukraine and then the Hamas, Israel, and now Hezbollah in Iran conflict. But there'll be other things, I mean, she is told, the People's Liberation Army to be ready by 2027. A lot can happen between now and then to make it go or no go, but that threat is higher. But things go on. When you suffer setbacks, you figure out how to recover. And so people in the middle of their career starting out, public service and national security service is a really high calling. We deprecate it a little bit today, but when you're doing something important for the country, you feel it. And nothing. People used to ask me when I was Undersecretary for Intelligence, how do you keep all these top hackers in NSA, when they could make 10 times that money in the private sector? Well, they get to work on the world's toughest hacking problems. I mean, they have the coolest jobs just about there is, and and they're doing something important for the country. So, so I could give other advice about, what to do at different stages of a career, but it's a noble calling.
Yeah, so my question was about a forecast.
Oh, forecast. So yeah, I don't know forecast, but in intelligence, we talk about secrets versus mysteries, and secrets are things we're trying to steal. And when we get them and they can answer a big question, that's really good. But the world is very complicated. What a mystery is something there's no secret you can steal. Like, is the Soviet Union going to collapse? Gorbachev. And so there's no, you have indicators of stuff. Or Arab Spring. President Obama was really upset about why we didn't know that Arab Spring was going to start here and spread to here. And once we got in the middle of it, we got very good, as America often does. But those kinds of things tend to surprise you. And one thing I can safely predict is you'll have more of this, and the world is getting more dangerous. But the thing that keeps me awake as an old geezer now, and my former 4-star colleagues and others, is our domestic divisions. We can handle China, we can handle Russia with the right policies and others. The source of our strength comes from our sense of society. If you look at why we won the first Cold War, it was a systems competition. Like I reflected at one point, we and the Soviets, we were doing really well recruiting Soviets in the late 70s and early 80s. And then we got betrayed in 1985 by Aldrich Ames and then an FBI guy, Robert Hansen and stuff. And it wiped out a lot, 10 people were executed in the Soviet Union and others. But if you looked at who was spying for us from the Soviet Union and who was spying for the Russians, independent of the value of the information, you'd see that theirs were the best and brightest of their system that had lost faith in it. And where ours were drunks and malcontents, and, you know, they can still kill you. But, you know, it kind of reflected something about the health of the two societies, you know, that your elites are betraying you rather than some disgruntled jerk, you know, so.
Well, if it's okay, we can, would you mind taking a few questions?
Oh, absolutely, sure.
Okay, and here's some water.
Okay. Thanks.
And we'll run the mic to you.
I was gonna say, go ahead. Howard, you know. Go ahead. I was kind of, I know you just said, you know.
There we go. I was kind of wondering, I know you said you don't do forecasts, but given recent moves of additional United States troops into the Middle East, and ordering the Abraham Lincoln to stay in like the CENTCOM area, what is your prediction about how the US role is gonna play a part in the very rapidly escalating crisis in the Middle East?
Yeah, so one, you know, the president is still calling for a ceasefire. And you know, the posture of the forces there is really defensive. It's to help with the defense of Israel, not for offensive action. So, you know, and that implies that they think this will be, you know, spasms and but a short war that will come to an end at some point. They could be wrong about that. But you know, and even the Israeli incursion that started, you know, it's designed to push them back beyond the Litani River, but then withdraw the forces because they had an unhappy experience between 82 and the early 90s in South Lebanon. So, you know, if you were looking for a central, you know, baseline forecast, it would, you know, be that the sides really don't want all that conflict. You know, I mean, like a puzzling question is why are the Iranians so inept? You know, like they telegraph their response in advance, and you know, and is it to show I'm doing something, but I don't want to do something that really hurts the Israelis because if I kill a lot of civilians, I'm going to get real trouble back. And if they kill Hassan Nasrallah and know where he is all the time, and they've stolen stuff out of Iran, you know, do they know where I am? And I might not like that very much as a supreme leader. So, you know, I think it will the long war will go on, but the immediate war, I think, will probably come to an end in a shorter period. Now, you know, if you look at Gaza, that's a different problem because they're not done there and they don't have a plan for the day after. That's incredible. Who's actually going to replace? Is it possible to replace Hamas and hold it? And then, you know, what happens to you know, most of the world expects that some diplomatic agreement that gives the Palestinians a state will come out of this, and that doesn't look likely right now. So you know, so the long-term trouble continues.
Sir, thank you for your time this evening. Christina Willis, I'm a military intelligence officer with the National Defense University. I was hoping to get your experience, your opinions. Through the decades, you've seen a lot of shifting of the intelligence community from great power competition back to counterterrorism. And I was curious if you think the recent shift, really looking at the 2022 National Defense Strategy, if that shift in the intelligence community from counterterrorism to the great power competition is proportionate. In addition, or could you elaborate on if this is potentially opening a risk for the U.S. for strategic distraction, where we may have overlooked persistent or emergent threats from other areas?
So, you know, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union got more than 50% of our IC resources, and the rest was distributed, you know, elsewhere. And that still remains true in the sense that China and Iran and Russia has caught up more recently, but you know, they still put a big share of resources. You know, so even in the heyday of counterterrorism, which was also there was plenty of focus on China. You know, the area that suffered was Russia because there was so much on the Soviet Union since they, you know, collapsed and came out of it. We lost a lot of the operational and tactical and focused on their leadership and their nuclear weapons and other things, but not the armed forces. So we've paid a price for that. You know, as they've recovered some, but also we've gone into country. You know, like, you know, for instance, with the general judgment that Russia would do much better against Ukraine than it did. And so that's being recalibrated and stuff. But yeah, you know, if you just focus on you know, the so-called pivot to China and stuff, you know, if you completely ignore the global jihadists or you ignore Iran or you ignore North Korea, you can overdo it. But if you underdo it, you're probably going to get some unpleasant surprises. You know, it always happens. And so, you know, you have to figure out what's the right strategy, kind of, you know, if it's a lesser threat, but still one you got to pay attention to because it can divert you and everything else. What's the economy of force solution you can do to monitor it so you don't go back to pre-9/11 occasionally in a different direction? You know, there's some danger of that. We focus too much. Same thing with, you know, this administration hoped that Russia wouldn't be a problem when they came in, and we were unpleasantly surprised. You know, there was this phrase about parking Russia. Well, you know, maybe it was a tank park or something, but you know, for mobilization. And then same thing, you know, my buddy, the National Security Advisor I served with in a number of posts, had just written a foreign affairs article saying the Middle East is more stable than it's been in 20 years, right before Gaza started. So, you know, you got to be careful again with forecasting and predictions, but those things do happen. Lots of different agents in the world that are acting on their impulses.
Hi, sir. I was just wondering, so right before coming to Duke, I was doing work on extremist groups around the US, and I was gathering intelligence on them. And I was also documenting war crimes in Ukraine and Sudan. And I was just wondering, from a intelligence perspective, how would you go about, or like, are there distinctions between when conducting a threat assessment between a state actor and a non-state actor?
Well, state actors, you know, generally have more capability, but, you know, assessments, you know, do the best they can. So, you know, certainly before 9/11, CIA was convinced that Al-Qaeda wanted to strike the United States, but they didn't know how or when. You know, they lacked the actionable information to make it real. You know, so they had kind of the strategic picture right, but not the tactical. And that, you know, that played itself out over the last 20 years in various ways too. So, you know, and as I said, as terrorism went up, we got a lot in terms of our priorities. We got a lot better at intelligence. You know, we had human assets and a lot of technical means, and, you know, and part of it is developing the capabilities that will generate that stuff. You know, I talked about our special ops in Iraq that will do a lot of intelligence, but you know, that's kind of after the fact. So right now we're in a worse position, I would say, because you know, the platforms we had, like Afghanistan, we had a friendly government that could also help us collect on folks in Afghanistan. We don't have any, you know, so the assets that we have over time, they'll dwindle or they'll get caught or, you know, other things. So.
Thank you so much. I would like to please ask about the mid-80s when the United States and Saudi Arabia jointly supported and funded groups in Afghanistan. Some argues that like the two countries provided the equivalent of $7 billion for these groups there, but could have done more after the conflict in taking back these equipments. So these groups would not use them against US or Saudi interests later on. And the second question I have is regarding Ahmed Shah Massoud, how significant he was for the US and in the conflict in Afghanistan, and how did his assassination change the US perspective on the conflict there? Thank you so much.
Okay, so lots of questions. So one, it was more like $10 billion, not 7. But the Soviets spent like 75, so it was a bargain from our perspective. And the second part, I guess, is about the aftermath. And yes, we and the Saudis matched us dollar for dollar. The trouble is after the last Soviet soldier leaves Afghanistan in February 1989, 1989 is this miraculous, we achieved something people didn't think was possible. But then 1989 is even more glorious, and the Berlin Wall falls. And so US attention shifts to reunifying Germany and liberating Eastern Europe. And, these third world wars, they're kind of a thing of the, necessary consequence of the Cold War, but, we can move beyond that. And so we start losing interest. And then there were also legislative restrictions that if a president couldn't certify that Pakistan wasn't beyond the point of no return on nuclear weapons, we'd have to cut off all aid, which happened in 1990. So we essentially kind of left the region. And then Afghanistan descends into civil war between 92 and 96. And, people think it's unfortunate, but it's just like another one of these horrible conflicts in the third world, not with global implications like you see in Sudan or everywhere else. And so, and out of that, then you get the Taliban and Al Qaeda, and it brings you up to 9/11. But also policy brings you up to 9/11 in the sense we don't think they're going to really do this attack against the United States. It's more like, we have our embassies blown up in East Africa in 1998, and then a ship attacked off Yemen, the USS Cole, that, it's more like Hezbollah, it's one-off events that are horrible, but it's not a big war. And, so there's a number of kind of misassessments of this winning the war, but failing to secure the peace in the 1990s, and thinking, we're back to Europe and what matters, and, stitching the world together. And this is just, the frontiers that don't matter as much. And all that proved wrong on 9/11. Ahmad Shah Massoud was, in my mind, our most effective resistance commander, and ended up becoming the Minister of Defense for a while. And then the Taliban had him bottled up in northeastern Afghanistan right before 9/11. Then he was assassinated 2 days before by 2 Al Qaeda members. And, it was a loss personally for me, and we lost some other commanders early on. But, in the 1980s, we had 300 commanders and, maybe a dozen major ones, Massoud being one of them that I dealt with. And so while he was the best of them, there were others who were good. And again, it was a team sport. So, and then, to your question about what difference did he make that he was assassinated, it's back to that escalation dominance. Once 9/11 happened and we said we're going in and going to start using air power, we could take this bottled up force and have them defeat the Taliban. One of my old commanders who ended up becoming Minister of Defense in Afghanistan said, Mike, you and I like being insurgents more than counterinsurgents. And, that there's a lot of truth in that, so.
Sir, thank you for your time this evening. You mentioned the IC distinction between those things that are secrets and those that are mysteries, but you've also had some work kind of lifting the veil on mysteries, doing wargaming work in the 90s, and especially with Future Warfare 20XX, and kind of lifting the veil on the A2AD problem that we're facing now and a number of other problems. Can you talk to us about how you've used wargaming both as a designer in the think tank world, and how you've kind of received wargaming reports as under an assistant secretary, how you've folded that into how you think about these difficult policy problems and maybe lifting the veil on some of those future mysteries?
Yeah, so they're different purposes. So, at one level, you have highly engineered and instrumented war games, very expensive, that actually try to take into account physics effects. And, so you have to have a lot of control to do that. You have to really understand all the dynamics of war, and we never really do. Those things you can't quantify. But, it's like weapons ranges and the probability of kill. And, so that's one level. And it's valuable for testing war plans, but only so much so. And then the kind of thing you're talking about, the future war games, if you think things are going to change, and you mentioned Future War 20XX that looked at a rising China in the 2020s or something back in the 1990s. And that's really aimed at taking current mid-grade officers, field grade officers, essentially majors, lieutenant colonels in Army, Air Force, and Marine parlance, and put them, in a situation that's 25, 30 years away to see how would you fight with these things when you got to fight in space, when you got cyber, when you have lots of systems, when you have biological stuff, and it's to stimulate their thinking and kind of refine these concepts so we then can make investments about what works and what doesn't. And it only gives you a certain level of fidelity, but it's valuable because, it's getting you out of the day-to-day and thinking about a different world, how people weren't thinking a lot about what war might look like in 2020 against China or in space or elsewhere. And, so it paves the way and you continue to work at it. And then at the top level, where policymakers are really busy, usually we do these little tabletop exercises because they don't have time during the week. So we gather in the White House on a Saturday morning and we have 4 hours where, I know you don't want to consider this, but what if Pakistan was missing some of its nuclear weapons and terrorists got it? So what would you do? And, one, they don't like that very much, but, it's usually played in a couple moves, mainly, again, just to get policymakers to devote at least 4 hours to something that they'd rather not do. And it's usually these hard problems. Or Russia invades the Baltics, and then threatens to use nuclear weapons if we don't back down. So it's very narrowly focused on kind of an unpleasant problem that they don't deal with, because they're consumed with other wars or policies or whatever. And so, each has its audience. But wargaming played a really big role, as in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, in figuring out, how we were going to do War Plan Orange in the Pacific against Japan. And, you learn a lot of things like, sortie generate, tactical things, sortie, how many aircraft can I put on an aircraft carrier deck? And, we get it up to like 90 or so from 20 some, and it makes a difference.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. So, given the rise in domestic terrorism, counterintelligence, technological revolution, mass amount of data that you mentioned, and the FBI's expanding role in addressing these new threats, do you think it's more appropriate to expand the FBI and CIA's existing authorities in domestic intelligence collection, or creating a new agency with clearly specified authorities to collect that intelligence? And also considering the intelligence coordination and sharing aspect of it.
So, one of the problems we had before 9/11 was this foreign domestic divide that terrorists didn't respect. And, treating it as law enforcement in one case and intelligence as the other, and created seams, and that got fixed after. But, the FBI really transformed itself after. It had, I may have the numbers wrong, but a few hundred people working on counterterrorism before 9/11, and that went up by a factor of 20 or something, to like 4,000 or something. And I think total numbers of the FBI like 30-some thousand. So big chunk, and national security across the board, including intelligence and domestic human operations and others, got an increasing share, almost 50% of compared to traditional crime. And, so it had already gone through that adaptation. Now it faces a different kind of challenge. You know, we talked about counterterrorism versus great power competition, but the counterintelligence threat is higher than it's been. Technology theft is a problem. The homegrown domestic extremism is a problem. The malicious information influence and cyber crime is a problem. And so they've got an expanded portfolio. So some of it may be authorities, and that matters. You know, I know the CIA world better than the FBI world, but it's also, I think, resources and honestly respect. We got to stop, you know, treating them as this punching bag. You know, fix what needs to be fixed, but you know, they've got a challenging mission. You know, we want them to succeed at. So, and then with CIA, you know, it's the reverse side of that about overseas and covert action, and you know, are they adopting the new technologies and other things. But some of us are focused.
Okay, time for one final question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, sir. Thank you so much for coming. So Israel has intervened in Lebanon a couple of times in the past, and both times those outcomes were not what was expected when they went in.
Right.
My question is, this time Israel sent in ground forces again. Is there anything that we can do to ensure that the outcome is at the very least decent?
No, I mean, I think, yeah, yes, you know, we can influence at the margin, but they're gonna make their own decisions. I do think they've learned lessons from the previous. You know, they went in 82 to eject the PLO. They succeeded at that, and Lebanese Hezbollah got created, and you know, Lebanon got turned upside down in various ways. And so then, you know, over years, what was a very painful campaign in the South for them, of attrition, they left. And then 2006, they weren't really prepared for how Hezbollah had evolved very well, so they took more casualties. But this time, I think they're more, you know, they have more limited ambitions to try to push Hezbollah back. Now, the problem is when they leave, you know, it's the reverse side of what you were asking. When they leave, what happens when those guys come back? You know, you win a temporary victory, but you don't, you know, you don't win a permanent. You know, one of the big lessons of my life, I think, is that no matter how successful your strategy is, in a period of time, you know, if you're wildly successful, if you look at history, maybe you buy, you know, 50 years or something of a good outcome. Success is never final. You know, you're handing it off to future generations. They're going to have their own challenges. New challenges will rise, and you know, it's just the constant drumbeat of history. So, you know,
Well,
just like our victory in the Cold War was a great thing. You look at the world today and you think, you know, how do we get from there to here? Well, lots of stuff happened in between. And
well, I hope that you feel reassured by this
I
group of
do.
students who are taking the baton.
I do.
And so everyone, if you would just please join me in thanking Dr. Vickers for coming.